troubleshooting, logs, review, and wrap up. Well, this is it. This is our last nugget. We've gotten all the way through these 20, and now we're going to finish up with a short discussion on what to do when things go wrong. Now, any kind of conversation on troubleshooting is always really hard to prepare for because it's really hard to give you really an idea about what to do given certain circumstances. If we try to use a use case approach, then I can give you 3 or 4 different things that could go wrong and what the solutions for those 4 things may be, but you may never see those 4 things when you're throughout the whole use of your virtual infrastructure. And so rather than really talking too much about what could go wrong and what you need to fix whenever something goes wrong, what we're going to talk about are some of the classes of problems that may occur on your virtual infrastructure and what you might want to do when those problems occur. Also, we're going to talk about how to make use of the VMware logs and also how to create log bundles and how to create these bundles if you get requests by VMware support for assistance and they need to get more information about what's going on in your virtual infrastructure. We're going to talk about VMs that won't start and any performance issues that may occur, and also the blue screen of death that you sometimes see inside of Windows. Well, VMware has what it's called the purple screen of death. And we'll show you an example of one of those purple screens of death. That's essentially when you get a panic in your ESX server and it doesn't know what to do, so it throws up a purple screen. The VM kernel throws it up. And it's a stop error, essentially, similar to the blue screen of death. We're going to talk about the VMware log files and how to create log bundles, both within a virtual infrastructure and also at the console. If for some reason your server is so horked up that it can't actually even connect into your virtual infrastructure client anymore. And then we'll finish with a little review about what we've talked about throughout this whole series and also a little wrap up of all of the topics that we've discussed and everything you need to know. I'm going to provide you some of the best practices that I've learned over time and the things that you just really all need to keep in the forefront of your mind anytime you're thinking about VMware and anytime you're thinking about how best to configure your VMware. Now, the very first thing I want to show you really is an example of one of those purple screens of death. And it's very similar to the blue screen of death that you're used to seeing within Windows, but it's obviously it's purple, and it comes as part of the VM kernel. It's an exception that the VM kernel throws up whenever there's something that's definitely going really badly wrong. Now, like the blue screen of death, the purple screen of death is a stop error. And so when you see this purple screen of death, this indicates that, well, first of all, the server is not going to function anymore, and it indicates that there's something that's definitely wrong deep down inside of the code, whether it's a problem with a memory stick in your server, or maybe it's a misconfiguration, or you've got a spin lock, or you've got any kind of the issues that can cause a stop error, unhandled exception, for example. Now, when you see this purple screen of death, really the worst part about the purple screen of death is just like the blue screen of death, in that it's really hard to get a snapshot of that unless you've got some sort of remote utility, where you've got a KVM or something that allow you to remote the screen, or you'll have to snap a picture. But what it's providing for you is essentially what the registry information is and the processors. Here's the CPU information up here. Here's some information about the exception that occurred. Here's the uptime information, and this is what the memory information is on the server. And so what it's doing at this point is also creating a core dump to disk to the area that's in your dump partition, if you've created a core partition for where it's going to store that dump information. You will, when you see this purple screen of death, essentially lose access to the server. If you reboot it, you know how blue screens of death occur. If you reboot it, about half the time it never happens again. My old rule of thumb with the old blue screen of death is never do anything with the blue screen of death until the second time it occurs. With the purple screens of death, you can almost argue too that you might want to wait and see if it occurs again. It may occur immediately. For example, if a memory stick is bad and it's causing all kinds of problems and corruption inside of the memory structures inside of ESX. If it happens immediately, then you know that you've got something that you can replicate. If it doesn't happen immediately, sometimes you can wait around to see if it occurs again and in what time frames and those sorts of things, because these are the questions that VMware support are going to ask you. Now, when you do get this purple screen of death and you're unable to resolve what the problem is, more often than not, the biggest deal is you need to call VMware support. And my argument in a lot of cases, and I've said this before in previous nuggets, a lot of the solutions that you'll get from VMware support is really to throw the disk in the drive and rebuild the server. And if you remember from when we talked about this before, the process of actually throwing in the disk and rebuilding the server sometimes is much, much easier than it is to try to troubleshoot what the problem is. VMware ESX is just that narrow shim layer, that shim OS that proxies the information or proxies the requests from the physical resources into the logical machines, into the virtual machines. And so by rebuilding it, you're immediately taking out any configuration issues that may be causing this problem and relegating it to specific physical problems. Again, a memory stick problem or a disk corruption or those sorts of things. And so a lot of times this purple screen of death indicates you're probably going to have to go with the rebuild as your first troubleshooting step. And then once you get the rebuild, you put the virtual machines back on. If it happens again, then you'll know that there's probably something wrong with your physical instance. Now, if you do get any kind of errors whatsoever, there are ways that you can create log bundles, so to speak, associated with all of the logs, the various configurations on the system, and pretty much everything that you need in order to ship off to VMware support so that they can do a little bit more deeper troubleshooting on what the problem is. If you've identified that you keep getting a purple screen of death and you've rebuilt it and you know it's not a hardware problem, well then that's when you need to start calling VMware support for your support. Now remember, when you buy VMware, when you buy ESX, you have to buy a support agreement with it. That's just one of the things you have to do. And so involving them early on sometimes helps you out because they can help you with the troubleshooting process. And at least personally, I've found that anytime I call support for any vendor whatsoever, the hardest part really is understanding what the problem is. 80% of figuring out the solution to the problem is figuring out exactly what the problem is. And so they have much more complex and much more beneficial tools that you don't have to parse this logs into useful format to come up with what an answer is. Now, if you go into your virtual infrastructure client here, under administration, you'll see this tool called Export Diagnostic Data. If I click on that, I'll get the opportunity to take a look at what sort of elements within my virtual infrastructure do I want to save that diagnostic data to. And then I can say, do I want to include information from the virtual center server? Do I want to just do the ESX servers? I am creating a bundle of all the logs on my system, and I'm putting them in a nice place on my client so that I can ship them off to VMware so they can take a look at what's wrong. You'll see here that I'm downloading the diagnostic data to the following location. I can browse for a different location for where I want to put that. I'm putting this in this VM diagnostic location here. Once you click OK, that will set off a process that can take a period of time to actually bundle up all those logs and then transfer those logs to the local machine. I'm going to cancel out of this, but I'm going to show you what that looks like once it arrives in a local machine. This is a complete log bundle download that is completed for the 0.101 server here and also the virtual center server here. You'll see here that for both of them the status is complete. There were no errors in downloading them. You'll see it arrives as a zip file for the virtual center server, and is a tar file more or less for the ESX server. And that's because the ESX server obviously is a Unix box, and so it has to figure out some way of zipping that file up, so it comes as a TGZ file. Now, once you get it, once the download has been completed, you'll see here that you get some folders sub to the folder that you've created, and those folders relate to the date and time that bundle was created. Let's take a look at a couple of these folders and see what's inside of these folders. You'll see here's the zip file that we created. There's that zip file for the VC support file, and there's the TGZ file for the VMware stuff, for the ESX stuff. Let me go into the zip file here, and we can see here's VC support, and here's the date and time that bundle was created. And what's created in here is some information about the license manager. Here's the license manager registry keys that have been set up for license manager. Here's the registry keys for any ODBC connections that were created. Here's the same thing, VMware registry keys and what's in here in the virtual center server and what's configured on the virtual center server. And then the VPXD information here. And if I can open this up here inside of Notepad, we can take a look at what this VPXD information is here. This is all XML-based information about what our VPXD configuration is. So this is some of the log information in terms of config. If we look at the DRM dumps, this is some dump information for us about the system and all of the dump information that's going on. This is all deep down in the registry information, not the registry, deep down in the register information that needs to be put into a dump utility that the VMware support people have to help them figure out what register locations things are going wrong and things are going correctly at. So this is really not handy human readable data for you, but it's useful for the VMware support people to understand what's going on inside of VMware, inside of the virtual center server. Lastly, we have log data, and this log data includes your application log on the server, your security and your system log, and then your LMGRD log, which is your license manager log. You can also get some more log information here about your VPXD TGZ logs, which is the virtual center log information. Now, you can look at this log information also directly using the virtual infrastructure client, and I'll show you how to do that here in just a second. But this is a dump of all of that data, an export of all of that data that they can import into their tool to help them figure out what problem is going on. Now, you'll see here that this is all the virtual center information. Now, the Unix information is in this TGZ file. Now, the TGZ file it's tarred up, and you have to actually go into Unix and untar to use a tool that can actually untar this information to pull this information back out. So we won't take a look at this here, but I'll show you how to do it here in the concept of at the service console as well. Now, if you think about the problems that may be occurring whenever you have a problem on your virtual infrastructure, some problems may occur also that prevent you or preclude you from actually pulling this information. Maybe you've got a server that's disconnected from the network, or maybe whatever is causing the purple screen of death is preventing you from your virtual infrastructure client from connecting into the ESX servers to pull this information back out. Remember, if we've got a problem, that problem typically occurs such that we can't get good information back out of it. And so in some cases, you may need to log in to your virtual infrastructure server to get that information back out. Now, one of the ways that you can log into your virtual infrastructure client to do that, again, is using PuTTY. So let's actually log in using PuTTY, and I'm going to show you one tool that you can use to actually create these same files, but doing it from the command prompt. So I'm going to log in as myself, and there's my login, and then I SU to root, so I can do it as root. And the tool that I want to use is VM-support. If I type in the VM-support command, it's going to, again, bundle up all the logs and complete this nice package, this nice tarball, if you will, this bundle of all of the log information that we've created. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this here is because the VM-support process can take a pretty extended period of time for it to do this compilation of all this log data. So you can see here it prepares the files, it waits for about 300 seconds, it does some background commands, it creates the archive, it creates this file here called ESX with the date, the time, and then .tgz. If it's a very large file, it notifies you that please don't email this to VMware because they'll have a FTP site for you. And then it also gives you the location of where you can create a support incident on their website and have them call you back and have them set up the location where you can FTP the sites up to it. One of the things you can do actually is you can use this tar-tzf file to get a view of what files are collected, of what actually is going to be in this bundle. So if I type tar-tzf and then /esx and then the tgz file, and I'm going to pipe this into the less command so I can see it page by page, you'll see here all of the different files that have been created by this bundle. There's some text files in here, there's a dump file, there's the dump log file, for example. Here's some more sysconfig, some more information about my networking information. There's information in here about, let's see, more VMware support version information. There's the VMK mod. Here's the gateway information. So all of this is really the entire configuration and log information of the ESX server that you created this VMware support file on. You'll need to have this so that you can give this to VMware support to give them the tools they need to figure out why you're getting that purple screen of death. But what if you're not interested in necessarily bundling up the logs? You just want to actually review them because you notice that there's a problem on your server and you want to, help out and figure out what that problem is. You can do that by going back into your virtual infrastructure client and clicking on View and clicking on Administration. And one of the tabs that we haven't worked with before is this System Logs tab here. Now, if you do it inside of the virtual infrastructure client, you're going to get information about the virtual infrastructure client. And you'll see here, if I drop this drop-down menu, this is the list of the Virtual Center server log here. I can't really look at the individual ESX server logs from this location, but I'll show you where you can do that here in just a second. So we're looking at vpxd-0.log, and this has some very current information into it. If I want to go down here to vpxd-0-log, I can look to previous information if I want to. But this allows me to look at the various components of what's going on my Virtual Center server. I can get an idea second by second of what it's attempting to do and what it's attempting to read and write to and update. Now on the ESX side, however, I have additional logs that I may want to look at as well. Here I've actually logged in directly into the ESX server as opposed to my Virtual Center instance. And by logging directly into my ESX server, I can also go back under the view and look at administration as well. So I click in here at administration and I see the System Logs tab, and you'll see now that I have a number of additional logs specific to ESX that I want to take a look at. I have the host D log, I have messages, which is the Linux component of it. This is the VM kernel log, this is any summary information about VM kernel, this is any warning information about VM kernel, and this is the virtual virtual center agent log as well. The messages log, for example, gives me information about the Unix side of what's going on. The VM kernel information gives me information about the VM side of what's going on. So depending on where the problem lies, it may be in one of these logs, one or another of these logs. Like I said before, too, you can always go into the, use PuTTY to go into the service console and use the tail command to view the last few lines of the log. So if the log that we're interested in looking at is var log messages, going back to our PuTTY instance right here, we can also type in tail var log messages to get the last few entries in our log file, for our message file, for example. If I want to do the last 50 entries, I can do tail-50 var log messages, and then pipe that into less, so I can see and page through the last 50 entries to get that information back out. Again, depending on what the problem is going to be inside of your ESX server, you may not necessarily be able to connect to that server via the virtual infrastructure client. So knowing how to get that log data both from the virtual infrastructure client and also directly from the console, which you generally always have the ability to log into, except that the machine is really, really bad, this is important to know so that you can help troubleshoot the problem, not only yourself, but also with VMware support whenever you're having a problem with VMware support. So be aware of both of these mechanisms which to pull log data out of your server and also to bundle that log data for the purposes of sending it off to VMware support. If you want to, you can bundle the log data here inside of the direct connection to ESX by clicking this Export Diagnostic Data location. If I click here, it's going to create the same sort of log bundle like it did connecting into the virtual infrastructure, but instead here I'm connecting in and just pulling that diagnostic data for the ESX server itself. Now, we talked about in our description of this particular nugget some various problems that you need to be aware of. And really this is more if you're thinking about taking that VCP exam. Some of the problems you may want to be aware of are, that, again, those VMs that won't start, and if there are any performance issues, or whether you get those purple screens of death on your system. But be aware that a lot of this information you can pull from your log data. You can understand that, okay, maybe my VM's not starting because I've got a permission problem in my inside of my Linux. Maybe I've screwed up the permissioning in there. Maybe I've got performance issues because one VM server has not got limits set, and with the limits not set, it's trying to consume too many of the resources, which is pushing out the other servers and not giving them the necessary performance issues they need. When it comes to purple screens of death, maybe I've got a hardware problem, or maybe I've got a spin lock problem, or maybe I've got a corruption in my OS that's causing these purple screens of death to occur. Depending on what those problems are, your solution may again be a rebuild, maybe a reconfiguration, or maybe just a call to VMware support to have them help you and handhold you through the process. So really, that's really the process of what you need to know in terms of troubleshooting, and really how you need to bundle those logs and get a look at those logs and take a look for what's going on, and time synchronize the problems that you're having with the timestamps that are on those logs. Obviously, it's important for you to make sure that the time is synchronized between the ESX server and the rest of your infrastructure, so that you know what's going on and can do that synchronization based on what time the problem is occurring. So I want to shift at this point now away from troubleshooting logs and really talk a little bit about the review of what we've talked about over the last number of nuggets. We've spent a lot of good quality time talking about not only workstation and not only ESX, but also virtual infrastructure. We started out with getting a good feeling for what is VMware Workstation. We talked about deploying and manipulating and converting those virtual machines. And we talked about the processes of doing cloning and teaming inside of Workstation, because all of that wraps into what we need to know for ESX. We then took our ESX server and dropped the CD in the drive and used our VMware Workstation to build our ESX instance. We built networking. We created virtual switches. We built this open filer instance that allows us to create iSCSI storage and NFS storage, and we showed an example of a production fiber channel storage instance so we can see what fiber channel storage looks like. We then took, and once we built out the Core 4, we took that into our virtual center infrastructure, and we understood what virtual center was, and we understood what the interface was and how to deploy virtual machines, which is, very similar to how it works inside of Workstation. We talked about vMotion and the hot migration, the needs that you need to know in order to do hot migration successfully, and how cold migrations are easier to do, but maybe don't keep that server up and operational whenever it occurs. Then we added to our vMotion knowledge by talking about resource and performance management, and also clusters and resource pools and DRS and HA. Then once we understood how we can get those machines moved around with those fancy features involving vMotion, we talked about the operations of virtual infrastructure involving user permissions and web access and backup and restore and disaster recovery. And we even did a little bit of a Linux 101 involving the service console and the commands associated with that service console. So I think we've kind of gone full circle with our VMware education and this knowledge transfer to allow you to start with Workstation and the very basic concepts and work their way into the very, very complicated and interesting concepts and all the really neat features associated with VMware virtual infrastructure. Now I want to leave you with a couple of best practices that at least I've learned over the years that hopefully I can help you so that you will do better in administering your virtual infrastructure. We've talked about it before, but you have to make sure you watch the HCL. If you're going to buy new equipment to actually use for production equipment for VMware for ESX, make sure that that equipment is on the ESX HCL. And we want to make sure of that because that and make sure to enable the vMotion component and to make sure that vMotion will function properly and the VM kernel will load properly inside of this equipment. Now, as VMware is moving closer and closer and getting more and more mature, the level of due diligence involved with making sure that your server equipment is on the HCL is getting less and less. And I'm not saying that necessarily because that's what VMware is saying, but really there are more and more white box equipment and those sorts of things that will actually boot the VM kernel. But you do want to make sure if you're using this in a production instance to always look for that HCL. Anytime that we move things into virtualization, you always have to consider security. You always have to make sure that you get your permissions correct, that you set your firewalls correctly, that you're patching your ESX server. We have to make sure that the patches go on that ESX server appropriately, and we have to make sure that also the Windows and other virtual machines that are sitting on top of that ESX server are also properly secured. Now, there are some neat and nifty things that we didn't talk about associated with VM security that you will now open up whenever you move into the virtualization environment. And I encourage you to look in the VMware partner ecosystem for other different types of security products that can help improve your security posture inside of your environment. Use virtualization to limit that data center access. Don't let people into your data center unless they're a trusted member of IT. And even if they are a trusted member of IT, if they don't need to be in the data center, then don't let them in the data center because they have the ability to remote that console. Use those DRS and HA capabilities. But don't overuse them. If you set up too many of those restrictions that prevent DRS and HA from functioning properly, then you're not going to get the best use of DRS and HA. So be very aware and let it do its job. For the most part, in certain circumstances, you want to set up affinity and anti-affinity rules, and you want to set up reservations and limits. But for the most part, a lot of those reservations and limits are only going to hinder DRS and HA from doing its job. You want to manage those resources for spike traffic. You want to make sure that you have enough resources available still in the server so that if you have a spike, if a bunch of people log on to the Citrix server and they consume all the resources, you still have enough resources to power the rest of your infrastructure. So make sure that you always power up and always build enough ESX servers so that you have the ability to still operate when you're in a spike condition. Use those templates and snapshots whenever possible. The best part about ESX is that you can build these Windows Server 2003 templates, and then you go poof, poof, and copy and paste, and the thing's ready to go. So I strongly suggest that you create ISOs of all the CDs and DVDs that you think you may need to use, and also create templates of the OSs that you think you may need to use, because it will significantly reduce the amount of time it takes for you to have to build new OSs and find those CDs that seem to get disappeared all the time. And put those CDs, those ISOs for those CDs on low performance storage. If you've got an NFS server out there that's got a little bit of extra disk space, use that as a data store so that all of your servers can connect into that data store to pull those ISO files off of. So you're not consuming all of that high cost fiber channel storage that you may have. Some more best practices. Always consider a virtualization assessment before implementing. And remember, when we talked about performance, once you move into the virtualization environment, it's a little bit harder to kind of get a true representation of what performance is. And if you don't do that virtualization assessment before you virtualize that server, before you P2V that server, you may not realize that Exchange server is running at 85% utilized all the time and doesn't really work inside of the virtualization environment. So always, before you decide to P2V any server, take a look at its performance, take a look at its configuration, make sure that it is a virtualization candidate before it goes in. That dovetails really well into our second bullet point here to remember that not all physical servers are virtualization candidates. Again, you have a SQL server out there, and that SQL server is processing 1 million transactions a second. It's probably not going to compress very well with the other servers on that ESX server. Now, it's not to say that you couldn't buy an ESX server to have one virtual server on it, but if compression is your goal, if your goal is to have as many servers squished onto one server at once, then maybe that's not not a good virtualization candidate for you. Anytime that you're building a virtualization infrastructure, you have to make sure that you architect that additional capacity in there for DRS and for HA. If I have 20 virtual machines and I try to put them on 2 virtual servers, and those virtual servers only have enough performance to support the 20 virtual machines, then if I lose one of the chassis, then all the machines try to power on the other server, and it's going to really, really slow things down. So you always need to have that sort of N+1 configuration for whenever you're architecting that additional capacity, so that if you do have a failure, that you will have the ability to reboot those systems on other servers and not impact your existing performance. And lastly, just remember that you as the administrator is often the least stable part of virtualization. You know, that virtualization software for the most part is pretty bomb-proof. It sometimes has its problems, but that's what the VMware support people are for. And most of the time, the biggest problem is you, the administrator, accidentally hitting that red VCR button and shutting down the server. So be very careful and be very, very cognizant and use due diligence to make sure that you're doing the right things, and always double check. You know what they say, measure twice and cut once. So these are some best practices for us. As I said before in the first nugget, there are some additional resources that you can take a look at that are out there on the internet. There's lots and lots of resources, but I want to hone you down on just a few that I personally look at all the time, and I think you'll probably enjoy as well. Obviously, VMware.com is a great place to go. It's got great documentation. It's the VM Technology Network, and the support forums are in there for giving you information about what's going on. Again, we didn't really talk about individual entries in those logs, because doing that really it could take long time to try to help us decipher what those individual entries are for. But if you have one that's really concerning you and you're not sure why you're having the problem that you're having, those support forums are an excellent location at VMware.com to help you figure it out, because the people there are really, really good at helping people figure out what's the problem with their VMware support. A couple of guys that are buddies of mine, www.rtfm.co.uk, that's Mike Laverick's website. He does a lot of really good technical information about what's going on in the virtualization space. www.virtualization.info, Alessandro over there has some great information about what's going on in the business world, what new technologies are coming out, what should interest you from the marketing perspective. And also my own real-time Windows Server community, where we talk about Windows Server topics, trends, and technology. And we also, as part of that, because virtualization is a part of Windows Server, we talk about virtualization and we talk about VMware in that community as well. And I strongly suggest you join us in the Windows Server community, because it's a great place to go, and it's a really great place for you to get good information about what's going on in the world. I want to really thank you for taking the time to really, really learn from us and really help me learn as well, because this is always a learning experience building these nugget series and learning about all the fun things that are involved with VMware and ESX and virtual infrastructure. This has been a great experience for me, and I hope that you have come out of this with a takeaway that you now feel more comfortable with VMware, you feel more comfortable with the virtual infrastructure, and you feel like you can now go out and be successful in virtualizing your infrastructure. I hope this has been really informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.